Good morning. Today we look at Psalms 120, 121, and 122. So we get three of them today. And Psalm 120 is a cry to the Lord for help. The psalmist is far, far from Israel, far from home. He says, I'm an alien in Meshach and Kedar, which are some remote, faraway regions, northern Africa, Asia Minor, somewhere. He's far from home and he's homesick, basically. But it starts out, in my distress, I cry to the Lord that he may answer me. Deliver me, O Lord, from lying lips and a deceitful tongue. So again, someone is saying untruths about him, speaking slander, lying that way. And then he says that, what more shall be done to you, a deceitful tongue? And then verse 4, a warrior's sharp arrows with glowing coals of the broom tree. So a warrior's sharp arrow, that's, you're getting injured, you're getting impaled by this, and this is sometimes how slander, lies, work and feel. And, the glowing coals of a broom tree grew, burnt hot, and it burnt long. And you think of a broom, the way the broom is made, or think of an evergreen tree. A live evergreen tree, a real evergreen tree, after you used it for a Christmas tree and it's all dried out, and what happens when it burns? It goes whoosh, and the needles burn fast and furious, and that's the way a broom tree would start. But unlike that evergreen tree, the broom tree has hot coals and burns long, and so it's, the image is that the arrow hits and bites deep and the wound lingers. You think about if someone tells a lie about you, and even if it gets corrected later, it still hurts. It's still there. It doesn't just go away. It kind of sits there and burns within you. And that's, I think, kind of the image of this. And then again, we get to that verse 5 where he is an alien and far from Israel, far from home. And, too long, he said, I've had my dwelling among those who hate peace. To live amongst, in an area that there's all of this unrest and war. And I think about that with all of the wars that are going on in the world and things that are happening, to live in those areas of the uncertainty and all of that, And verse 7, he says, I am for peace. Yeah, that's what we want. We want peace. We want quiet. We want to live in harmony. But when I speak, they are for war. So it's not a peace-loving nation. It's not a peaceable place where he is. There's stuff going on, and it's not all good stuff, And so the psalmist is crying out to the Lord for help in this desperate place he is. Psalm 121, I lift my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. Again, that reminder of who God is. And yeah, I know those two verses. They're pretty favorite verses of mine. But, our help comes from God. And, on this psalm, it's called a psalm of ascents. It's a psalm of that they would sing when they're going to travel, and often traveling the roads through the mountains, through the high places. Those were dangerous places. There were thieves and bandits. There were traps. There were ambushes along those mountainous roads that they had to take, and especially like to and from Jerusalem and stuff. Some of those roads were places of high terror as far as the travelers went. And not only that, but the hills were often places where the idol worshippers went to worship, and they had their poles, like the Asheran poles that we read about earlier in the Old Testament, that, these were poles where they would worship Baal and other false gods. And so sometimes the people would look to the hills to worship, but, to worship the false gods. But here the writer of this psalm, which, the writer isn't identified, but he lifts his eyes to the hills and says, where does my help come from? It comes from the Lord. It doesn't come from those false gods up on those hills. It doesn't come from those idols. It doesn't come from those statues that can do nothing. My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. And then verse 4, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. And it's he who keeps Israel, watches over them, has provided for. He doesn't slumber or sleep. I mean, God is eternal, and he is always watching and always there. And that's another good image of God. It says he is your keeper. He is your shade at your right hand, so the sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. And again, this psalm is a psalm that I have read at funerals. We read it. It comes up in the lectionary. We don't read the psalms where I'm leading worship, but it's a psalm of asking God for guidance, but also more importantly, I think a psalm that reminds anybody that reads it that God is always there. In the last verse, I mentioned this the other day. The last two verses, the Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. He will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore. And it's just, we talk about coming and going, and here this talks about you're going out and you're coming in. So you're going out, you're traveling, and you're coming in. You're coming back home again, and that's one of the things I think about as we live our lives on this earth. We are going on and about our daily living, and when this life ends, we are coming back into the eternal presence of God. Psalm 122 is a psalm of David again, and it starts, I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. Our feet are standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. And we have arrived. Let us go into the house of the Lord and to honor and worship, to praise and all of that. And I think about the house of the Lord, our Sunday morning worship gatherings. And now we're coming into the time of the year when there will be Wednesday school, the Wednesday meetings, and Wednesday is somewhat church night. It's really gotten hard in a lot of places for Wednesday to continue to be church night, but it's been a night that way that we've looked for that opportunity to take time out of all of the busyness and all of the schedules of a life to go to the house of the Lord. And he says, our feet are standing within your gates. And in Jerusalem, built as a city that is bound together, to it the tribes go up. The tribes of the Lord was as a decree for Israel, and so it's that home, it's that having a place, having a home, and when we go to worship, when we come into the house of the Lord. And the house of the Lord could be, right now, the house of the Lord. I'm sitting in my wood shop. I got my Bible open. I'm talking with you about God, about faith. The house of the Lord isn't only the church. The house of the Lord is the whole of creation. As I lift mine eyes to the hills, from where does my help come? As we just read in Psalm 121. But we are, no matter where we are in the presence of God, who is always there. And then verse 6, I think, is important. Then and now, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May the people who love you prosper. And I think about that. Israel wasn't for many. Israel did not exist for many years, and now Israel does exist. And Jerusalem, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Pray for peace in Israel. Pray for peace in the world. And, we think about Jerusalem, Israel, that's the promised land, the land that God promised to his people, to his chosen people, the Jews, and to pray for peace there amongst those people. And I was talking with a friend the other day, we were talking about Muslims and Christians, and Muslims trace their ancestry back to Ishmael, the son of Haggai, and Abraham. Christians trace their ancestry back to Isaac, the daughter of Sarah and Abraham. So these half brothers, and the friction that is still today between those nations. And so we pray for peace in Jerusalem, pray for peace in Israel, pray for peace among God's people.